I would say really all of Queen's Park is in shock. Jim and I were colleagues here from 2003 to 2005, but he served Ontario in the legislature from 1995 to 2005, and he was a feisty, articulate spirit in this place. I've worked with his wife, MPP Christine Elliott, who is a dedicated public servant in the Ontario legislature for many years, and I extend my deepest condolences to her and their three sons, John, Quinn, and Galen, at this moment of tragic loss. Canada has lost a great Canadian.
The reaction from the Ontario legislature by Premier Kathleen Wynne. Let's bring in the MPs to discuss Jim Flaherty, the man, his methods, and his legacy. Nathan Cullen is finance critic for the NDP. He joins us from Toronto here in the studio. We have Conservative MP Stella Ambler, who was a close friend of the former finance minister. Scott Bryson is a Liberal finance critic. Elizabeth May, the Green Party leader. You know, I don't think I've seen such unity of sadness on this place since Jack Layton died, and I guess that speaks to the force of personality here. I'd just like to go around the table and get some quick thoughts on Jim Flaherty, just on the afternoon he passed away. Stella, you knew him well. What comes to mind?
Well, we've spent some time together, our families, after the holidays, or during the Christmas holidays down south, and I saw, you know, a relaxed Jim with his family and his beautiful sons, and I just can't stop thinking about his sons right now. You know, they're young men, and all just terrific young men. It's just so sad for them. Sad for the whole country. When I worked for him, Don, like he just had such a force of personality.
Fun boss, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. But we did a lot of fun things together. But he worked so hard. I worked for him in his capacity, his lesser-known capacity as minister responsible for the Greater Toronto Area.
Right.
And so, of course, he had, you know, he had this other huge responsibility that not many people knew about. But he took that very seriously, and you know, and he was also very loyal to his staff, and in return, we were very loyal to him. Just an amazing guy to work for.
Nathan Cullen, what comes to mind when we say Jim Flaherty to you?
I think of, it was mentioned in your interview with Mr. Mulrooney, and I've heard it all day since the news. This might represent some of my bias, but a great Irish Canadian. That when you engaged with Jim, there was that sense of determined, a master politician and somebody who knew how to, the cut and thrust of politics, but also with a bit of a wink in his eye. And there's a lunch that Mr. Vickers and some others gather together once a year, and I got to attend that of other Irish notables, I guess. And you got the sense of what kind of politics he represented, which was that it could be tough, but it also had a certain humanity to it. And he sat just across from us where Tom Mulcair addresses the Prime Minister, and I was surprised sometimes where a gentle heckle or fun prod he'd respond to. He'd want to engage. He wanted to have that side of his politics. And I think of him in the Tim Hortons, you know, shots that you're rolling through your reel there. He was very much a Main Street finance minister more than a Bay Street one, and I don't know if that makes sense, but it was a feeling you had from him that he understood that aspect of finances and not so much the high-end finances, although he did that as well. But it's a real tough day. Stella said it very well, that this is really shocking to a lot of us because such a decent person, and Tom Mulcair, you know, as well, obviously so personally moved. He had that effect on people, and that's rare in our politics. So yeah, he'll be sorely missed.
Scott Bryson, you did battle with him quite a bit in the House of Commons. What went through your mind today?
Oh, we differed from time to time, but I never questioned his commitment to public service. And it's important to realize that it wasn't just Jim's commitment to public service, it was his family's. And he and Christine raised 3 boys in the fishbowl of public life. And so this was a family commitment and a family sacrifice. And both of them in active politics today.
Yeah, she's was an MPP in Ontario.
He was, I guess, a bit of a happy warrior. If you look at it, he had 4 provincial campaigns. He lost his first one in 1990. He picked himself up. He went on to bigger and better things in provincial politics. He ran 2 provincial leaderships, went into federal politics, and sometimes he won, sometimes he lost. But in the end, probably his greatest campaign was in the challenging global financial crisis. And in some ways, all these battles he had really toughened him, and I think gave him that strength that he needed at that time. But he was a fierce warrior and served the country well during difficult times.
Fierce warrior, yes, but he always seemed to have a smile. And we're surely talking to a lot of people today, and a lot of people smile when they think of Jim Flaherty. What do you think of Jim Flaherty, Elizabeth May?
Well, he always had... he was truly a gentleman. He was kind. I was very fond of him. And my first question to him in the House, I've been thinking back over it, he would refer to himself with a twinkle often as a leprechaun. And actually, I thinking about it later, I remember now what he said was, he said, when I asked him about whether he was planning an omnibus budget bill in 2011, that was my first question in the House after the election. And instead, he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye and said, "What have you got against munchkins?" What? He said, "Well, the former member, Gary Lund, we're going to miss him, and he, like me, what do you have against those of us who are..." So he had this little bit of humor about whether he was a leprechaun or a munchkin, and I once teased him. We were talking about a bill that was, this was a private conversation. I said, "Well, I think you'd be against this bill, Jim, because it's going to hurt unions, and you're a member of a union." He said, "What union?" I said, "Well, the Lollipop Guild, for heaven's sakes." And, and he roared. He said, "I'm going to use that." He was always across, in a nonpartisan sense, he was extremely likable.
You have all, well, 3 of the 4 of you here have had strong objections to some of his policies that have gone forward, but let's not speak ill of the policies he might have brought forward you didn't like. Was there one that you think served the country particularly well that he put forward? I'll nominate tax-free savings accounts for myself because I love using them. But anyway, Nathan Cullen, did he do a really good one, a signature one that you think he should claim for himself? Well,
one that he did and one that he questioned. I think the disability tax credit for folks with disabilities and an adoption tax credit as well. I thought there was humanity in that, and talking about families that might be having a tough time making ends meet under certain circumstances that might be trying. I think, to his credit, he also questioned the whole concept of income splitting, and did so in what I thought was a fair way, talking about just benefit, which was interesting when I read those comments, because he was trying to talk about what taxes do and the larger benefit, and whether this one helped enough people and whether it was worth it. And I thought, wow, you were asking earlier about the independence of a finance minister and how that power dynamic works out with the Prime Minister. And Jim Flaherty had a unique position, I think, within the Conservative front benches, that he had enough stature and experience and credibility on these things that he was able, in those occasions when he chose to either publicly or privately hold some position. And that's what you want in a finance minister, and that's where he was able to guide himself. So I think both on policies that he did and also ones that he questioned, I think he deserves a great deal of credit for it.
Elizabeth May?
Well, I have to say, we always had the sense of Jim Flaherty that he was one of the few people around Stephen Harper's cabinet table who had any kind of independence in terms of policy. And I think it was pretty clear to us in 2008 that a lot of what was in that economic statement that was later withdrawn was Stephen Harper pressing and Jim Flaherty pushing back. I'll always be grateful to him for this, in this last budget, something that I'd been hoping for and begging for, really, which was something called Lindsay's Law, to have a DNA data bank. And I'm glad that I found Jim Flaherty and gave him a big hug after the budget and said thank you for this, because it's going to be implemented in a couple years, but it should make a difference for the families of missing children.
Remember, you brought that up on the show. First thing you said, I want to say something nice about this budget right off the bat.
I'm very grateful for that.
Scott Bryson?
Well, I think if it would have been tremendously difficult, it was tremendously difficult, and the challenge represented by the global financial crisis in the autumn of 2008, and the response by Jim would not have been one that maybe ideologically would have been something that he would have been fond of for a long time, in terms of stimulus spending and deep deficits to try to deal with that. Ultimately, you had to deal with it. You had to work with all the finance ministers in the G20. You had to rise above whatever ideological blinders that a person would have from the past. And he did ultimately what he had to do, and you have to admire that. And I think history would judge he and those other finance ministers globally very well.
Final thoughts, Stella?
On the Nathan mentioned his work, his advocacy, and his initiatives that help the disabled, and it was something that really came from the heart. He had a big heart. He was a stubborn Irishman, but he also had a very big heart. Those two things often go hand in hand, and so this recent budget was a good example of the initiatives that help young people with vocational opportunities. He was a big proponent of programs and any kind of implementing projects and initiatives on about kids with autism. I mean, he was a family man, and he understood that ordinary Canadians needed these things to help make their lives better.
Well said. All right, thank you all. We really appreciate your coming in on this sad day.
It is a sad day.
It is
After
indeed.
the break, we'll bring in a pair of journalists who knew Mr. Flaherty personally and covered numerous budgets. They've got plenty of opinions too. Please stay with us.